So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Gabor Maté, and I know you're going to have a wonderful evening listening to him, and that'll be great food for thought for you, all of you who are concerned or interested in addictions. So let's give him a very warm welcome.
Thank you, Kaylin and Rebecca. Can you hear me at the back okay? Yeah, great. If there's any problem, just let us know. So thank you for honoring me by showing up tonight, and certainly it's an honor to have my book have been chosen, although it's an honor, but it's a deserved one. Because I happen to think it's the only book that makes any sense out of addictions out there. So I'm not necessarily modest about it, and it's not, you know, my brilliant insights, although they're there too, but I'm talking about the evidence that has accumulated over the years. I'm talking about the experience of thousands of people. I'm talking about the research that has been published on brain development, on addictions, on physiology, on psychology, on child development, on trauma. I'm talking about all that, and I'm talking about all that that is completely missing from the curricula of most medical schools, most schools of psychology, schools of education, nursing programs, public health programs, and so on. And that's not a blanket true statement, but largely it is true. So what I'll be presenting you with is a perspective that it's rather different from the mainstream, but which is evidence-based. And if there's one phrase I could eliminate from the medical lexicon, it would be this evidence-based practice. Because I only wish that we actually based our practice on the evidence. Then we would know that whenever we see cancer, or when we see arthritis, and certainly when we see mental health issues or addictions, we're not looking at random, isolated events in an individual. We're looking at something that has a history that is rooted not just in an individual, but in the history of that individual's family over the generations and in a larger society. Now, when we look at addictions, we're somewhat flabbergasted and we're shocked, really, at what people do to themselves. So I'll read you a little bit from the second chapter of In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, and it's entitled The Lethal Hold of Drugs, this chapter. And just a conversation I had with a client of mine. Now, I was a family practitioner for 20 years, 7 years I did palliative care work, and then for 12 years I worked in addiction medicine in Vancouver's downtown east side. So this is a scene from my clinic 9 years ago now. In March 2005, I had a discussion with Alan in his 40s and with HIV. Alan has been to Vancouver Hospital with sharp chest pains a few days earlier. He was told he had probably suffered a flare-up of endocarditis, an infection of the heart valves. Declining to be admitted to hospital, Alan presented himself for a second opinion at the emergency ward of St. Paul's Hospital, where he was assured that there was nothing wrong. Now he was in my office for a third assessment. On examination, I can see that he isn't acutely ill, but is nevertheless in terrible shape. "What should I do, Doc?" he asks, raising his shoulders and spreading his arms out in helpless consternation. "Okay," I say, reviewing his chart. "Your father died of heart disease. Your brother died of heart disease. You're a heavy smoker. You have a history of endocarditis from IV drug use. I'm treating you for cardiac failure, and even now your legs are swollen because your heart isn't pumping efficiently. Your HIV is controlled by strong medications, and with your hepatitis C, your liver is just hanging in there. But you still keep using and injecting, and you're asking me what you should do. What's wrong with this picture?" "I was hoping you'd say that," Alan replies. "You need to tell me that I'm a fucking retard. It's the only way I learn." "Okay, I oblige, you're a fucking retard." "Thanks, Doc. The trouble is you're not a fucking retard, you're addicted. And how are we to understand that?" Alan died 4 months later, cold blue on midnight, on the floor of his room in a nearby hotel. He was injecting, rumor had it, from a bad lot of methadone heisted in a break-in at a local pharmacy, and subsequently adulterated with crystal meth or who knows what. According to the coroner's office, that little enterprise in independent drug marketing caused the deaths of at least 8 people. "I'm not afraid of dying," a client told me. "Sometimes I'm more afraid of living." And that's the real issue. That's a real issue. Keith Richards, the Rolling Stone guitarist, who, as you know, had a significant heroin habit, in his autobiography, Life, he says, well, what was all that partying, heroin all about? He says, I suppose, he says, it was about the need for oblivion, the contortions we go through just not to be ourselves for a few hours. So the real issue is, why are so people afraid to be themselves? And why do they find life so challenging that they have to escape their consciousness by obtunding it with substances or certain behaviors? Now, that's not a question that either the society at large or the treatment industry really cares to ask. We have our assumptions about addiction. And the most common and prevalent addiction, and that's the one that informs the legal approach to drug use, is that it's a choice that people are making. It's just a bad choice. So if people are making a bad choice, then what do? Then you deter them from it. Basically, it's the punitive parent approach. The kid misbehaves, you punish him. You're not interested in what the kid is actually portraying through that behavior. You just want to stop the behavior. So it's one of heavy, and as you know in this country, extremely heavy legal sanctions. And the result of that approach is, you're probably aware, that the American population makes up 5% of the world's population as a whole, but 25% of the world's jail population. And that means that every fourth person in the world in jail is a citizen of the land of the free. And that's the result of this idea that this is all about choices that people are making. The second approach, which is what you might call the medical approach, is that addiction is actually a disease of the brain. And it impairs brain functioning and decision making and so on. Now, there's a lot of truth in that, of course. But when you ask what causes a brain disease, and if you go to the definition of addiction given by the American Society of Addiction Medicine, well, addiction is a brain disease and caused about 50% by genetic predisposition. Now, what the choice model and the addiction and the disease model have in common, though, as different as they are, and they almost seem antithetical, because if it's a choice, then why are you punishing it? If it's a choice, then why talk about a brain disease? And if it's a brain disease, then why punish people? So the two seem contradictory, but they have one thing in common. And what they have in common is that they both take society off the hook. If it's genes that we inherited or bad choices that we made as individuals, then we don't have to look at what actually happens to people in our culture. We don't have to look at what happened to them in childhood. We don't have to look at social policies that favor some groups over others. We don't have to look at the history of certain minority groups in this country or in my country, Canada. It's just choice or genes. So, different as they are, both of these perspectives allow us to avert our eyes from some very disturbing social questions and some very painful individual questions. There's only one problem with that approach. Both those approaches, they happen not to be true. Now, if you look at the genetic perspective, let me give you a clear example, a tragic example actually, that's shared by your country and mine, which is the experience of the Aboriginal people here. Now, there were substances that changed consciousness known and used by the natives prior to the colonization from Europe. There was peyote, as you know, in some areas of North America. In southern United States and in Mexico, there were alcoholic spirits. There was tobacco known to many of the natives, psychedelic mushrooms, and so on. And as I said, not only were these substances known, but they were used. They were used regularly, without addiction. How were they used? Ceremonially. Now, the ceremonial use of a substance is the direct opposite of the addictive use. Because the addictive use is all about obtunding consciousness. It's about going blotto. It's about escaping. It's the contortions we go through just not to be ourselves for a few hours, to quote again Keith Richards. Ceremonial use is to reach a higher level of consciousness. It's to be more connected. It's to be more aware. It's a ritual thing that you engage in with community, not in the isolation of your room and in shame. So it's the very direct opposite. Now, if these people were genetically programmed to be addicted, why was there no addiction prior to colonization? And not only that, even after colonization, and you get these very strong alcoholic substances introduced by Europeans, even then that didn't lead automatically to addiction. Like the Innu, the so-called Eskimos of northern Canada, they drank the whiskey and they loved it and they go drunk and so on, but they were not alcoholics. They were able to live their lives, go hunting, fishing, maintain their communities, bring up children in a healthy way, until something happened. And that thing that happened is when they lost their right to live their lives the way they knew how to do it. So addiction could not have been genetic, because if it was, they should have been addicted a long time ago. So that's the first problem with those perspectives, is that they're not true. Secondly, one way or the other, they make an assumption. And along the many mythologies that bedevil the addiction field is this idea that drugs are addictive. I mean, no, they're not. I mean, let me ask you this question. Is alcohol addictive? Well, if I asked amongst you here how many have ever had an alcoholic beverage, most of you, I dare say, would put your hand up. But if then I asked how many of you had an addictive relationship to alcohol, it'd be a much smaller number. If the alcohol was addictive in itself, you should all be addicted. You should all be alcoholics. Most people who try most drugs, whether it's heroin, crystal meth, cocaine, cigarettes, caffeine, alcohol, never become addicted. Therefore, you cannot explain the addiction by the power of the drug itself. Nor can you therefore stop addiction by trying to stop the availability of substances. The real issue is, why are some people driven to addictive behaviors? What is it that impels them in that direction? And once they've had that experience, why can't I give it up? Now for that, you have to look at individual lives and social issues in a broader context. You're not going to resolve that one by doing brain scans on people and showing that they've impaired brain circuits, which they do. But how did they get there? That's the question. And what I'm suggesting to you, that if the choice model and the disease model are inadequate to the explanation of addiction, then what's really going on? What's really going on is that the central fact about human existence is utterly ignored in mainstream medical theory, which is that the brain is inseparable from the body and the individual is inseparable from the environment. Now that little baby there, every second that I speak, he or she has millions of new connections being formed in the brain. And all that is happening in relationship to the environment. And I'll explain something about that later on. So that you can't separate brain physiology from the environment. And this is true for all of our lives. So you can't separate the mind from the body, as we do in Western medicine, and you can't separate the individual from the environment. And so what we really need, what we require, is what's been called a biopsychosocial perspective. And biopsychosocial means that the biology of people is shaped and influenced by their psychological and social relationships. And that's really easy to show. So we know, for example, that kids whose parents are stressed are more likely to have asthma. So in polluted areas where there's more asthma, it's the kids whose parents are most stressed who are most likely to have the asthma. And I'm not going to go into the physiology of it, except to say that we actually treat asthma with stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol. But we never ask ourselves, gee, what's going on? Does stress have something to do with it, maybe? Well, what's really going on is that the emotional stresses on the parent are affecting and having an impact on the physiology of the child, including their lung physiology and their immune system. And this goes on all of our lives. And of course, the more sensitive we are, the more we're affected by the environment. And that sensitivity to environmental influence may be genetically influenced. But that doesn't mean that you're going to inherit a certain disease. It just means that you'll be more prone to be affected by the environment. It's still the environment that shows up and does this or that or the other. Now, in my 50s, when I was 55 or so, and I was the medical coordinator of the palliative care unit at the Vancouver Hospital, I was diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Well, self-diagnosed actually, after somebody on the unit, the social worker, invited me to have coffee with her, and when she told me about her diagnosis, I understood why she invited me to have coffee. And I just recognized myself, and then eventually I was diagnosed by a psychiatrist, and I was given stimulant medication called Ritalin, but that made me depressed, so I took Dexedrine, and I took that for a while. What these stimulant medications do is they elevate the level of a chemical in the brain called dopamine. Now, dopamine is the central brain transmitter, neurotransmitter. I'll be telling you about it in a little while. But what else elevates dopamine levels? Well, all the stimulants do. What are the stimulants? Well, Dexedrine, Ritalin, cocaine, crystal meth, caffeine, and nicotine. Guess what? A lot of the people who get hooked on these substances are actually self-medicating ADHD. So, on one level, in the medical sense, addictions are always about self-medication. Always about self-medication. Now, cocaine not only elevates dopamine levels, it also, like Prozac, blocks the uptake of serotonin. And serotonin is an important brain chemical implicated in mood regulation. People self-medicate depression with cocaine. People self-medicate ADHD with alcohol and marijuana, which soothes the hyperactive brain. People self-medicate anxiety with marijuana or alcohol. People self-medicate social phobias with cocaine and alcohol or crystal meth. People self-medicate PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, with opiates. After the foreign adventures that your country seems addicted to, well supported by my country, by the way, a lot of the veterans come back with PTSD hooked on opiates. It's a self-medication. So on one level, addiction is a self-medication. On a narrow medical level, but we have to go beyond that narrow medical model. But we have to recognize what's going on here. In other words, and actually, when I go around speaking about this issue, and I ask people, I won't do it now, but I did this afternoon. I asked people, well, how many of you have an addictive relationship to a substance or to a behavior? And a number of people put their hand up. And the next question is, and what did it do for you? What does it do for you? Well, it gave me peace of mind. It gave me a sense of control. It connected me to other people. It soothed my pain. It made me relax. Well, what's wrong with any of that? Who does not want to be relaxed, connected to other people, have a sense of mastery, and have less distress, have less pain? In other words, you got to get this. The drug user, and particularly addicted drug user, just wants to be a normal human being. That's all they want. They want what life should give them, but for some reason has not. They want something we all want. Now, if we look at the drugs and their relationship to brain physiology a bit more closely, what do we find? Well, let's look at the opiates. Now, the opiates derived from the opium plant that goes in Afghanistan. They're the most powerful pain relievers that we have. So in palliative care work, in looking after the terminally ill, I could be really grateful for the opiate medications, because without that, a lot of people would suffer agony in their last weeks or months of life. But the opiates don't only soothe physical pain, they also soothe emotional pain. In fact, on brain scans, when you wound people emotionally, the same part of the brain lights up as if you wounded them physically. And that part of the brain has a lot of receptors for opiate chemicals. So opiates are pain relievers, physical and emotional pain. As a matter of fact, if you look at the substance of abuse, they all pretty much have a pain relieving quality. Alcohol, as you know, is an analgesic. They used to be used before surgery for people, before the days of anesthetic. Cocaine is a local anesthetic. It numbs nerve endings. It's still used that way in certain kinds of nose surgery. It also shrinks blood vessels so there's less bleeding. Marijuana, as you know, has pain-relieving qualities. So the real question in addiction is, and if you get nothing from this lecture except this one line, just please remember this one. The real question is not why the addiction, but why the pain. And if you understand why the pain, you can't look at genes. You can't look at choices. You have to look at people's lives, and as I said earlier, their histories. Then the second question that arises is, well, why did the opiates even work in the human brain? Well, how come this product derived from a plant in Afghanistan has such a powerful impact on human neurophysiology? Well, the answer, of course, is that we have receptors for the opiates, receptors being molecules on our cells that can receive a messenger substance. And if the messenger substance fits into the receptor, then the two together will activate the cell to do something. In fact, the messenger receptor complex tells the DNA of the cell what to do. In other words, it's the environment that turns the genes on and off. And there's a whole new science called epigenetics that looks at how environmental influences actually trigger or turn off genetic activity and therefore influence lifelong patterns of behavior and physical responses. Epigenetics. So we have receptors for the opiates. But now why do we have receptors for something derived from a plant in Afghanistan? Well, of course, the answer is we do not. What we have receptors for are our own endogenous morphine-like substances, which, to put it in abbreviated form, are called endorphins. So we have an endorphin system, we have an internal opiate system. But why do we have that? Well, first of all, for pain relief. We need to have pain relief. So when you give people an inert medication for pain and 25% actually experience genuine pain relief, it's because the belief that they're getting help released endorphins in their brains. It's a physiological effect. So we have our own endorphins to relieve pain, which we have to have. That's their first function. Their second major function, equally important, is the sense of pleasure and reward, elation, joy. Now imagine your life without that. Human life is difficult enough, so that without that sweetening of joy and elation, we would be very miserable creatures. And their third function is actually the most important one. And the person who actually discovered the endorphin system, Candace Pert, called them molecules of love, because they make possible the loving interaction between two people, and especially between infant and parent. So if you took infant mice, this study was done by a great researcher here in the state of Washington, who at least works here now, Dr. Yak Panksepp. And Panksepp showed that if you take infant mice in a laboratory and you genetically knock out their endorphin receptors, these little mice will not cry for their mothers on separation. Now what would that mean in the wild? It would mean their death. So the opiates actually make life possible, because the human infant is the most immature, the most helpless, the least developed of any creature in the universe. And therefore, without that attachment relationship, there's simply no life. And so endorphins facilitate that attachment relationship. And that was exemplified by many conversations I had with drug addicts, but one of them, a sex trade worker who I quote in the book, said that she was 27, and I asked her this question, well, what does heroin do for you? She said, the first time I did heroin, it felt like a warm, soft hug. And this other fellow, 6 foot something, tattoos, muscles, scars, the whole thing in detox. And I said to him, well, what does heroin do for you? She said, I don't know how to tell you, he says, but it's sort of like you're 3 years old, and you're sick and you're shivering with fever. and your mother puts you on her lap, wraps you in a warm blanket, and gives you chicken soup. That's what heroin feels like. Well, these people are talking about love. So now, picture a human being who comes to the conclusion, for whatever reason, that without this substance, they're not going to have pain relief, escape from their misery. They're not going to have a sense of reward and joy, and they will not experience loving connection. What do you do to take it away from them? You put a sign on the wall like Betty Ford? Just say no. Just say no to love, pain relief, and joy. That's all you got to do. You know? Now, that's the opiates. Then I mentioned the stimulants, which elevate dopamine levels. Now, dopamine, you take a little mouse, this has been done in the laboratory. You put food in his mouth. He eats it, he chews it, he swallows it. But if you place the food a few inches away from his body, he will not budge to eat it, will in fact starve to death, rather than move to eat the food, because genetically they knocked out his dopamine receptors. And dopamine is the incentive motivation chemical. Without it, we're listless, inert, passive, inactive. Sort of like the average football fan. Sorry, I know you won the Super Bowl. You know. About which I may have something to say in a little while. So dopamine flows when you're seeking food, when you're seeking a sexual partner, when you're exploring a novel object or a novel environment, all of which are essential activities for human life. So that's another chemical without which life is not possible. And that's what the stimulant addicts are giving themselves when they do crystal meth or cocaine or nicotine or caffeine for that matter. There are other brain circuits implicated in addiction. One of them has to do with the regulation of stress. Now, stress is necessary. Stress, it's not a bad word, stress. Stress just means a response in the body to a threat. And how we respond, to make a long story short, is after certain brain messages, we end up releasing stress chemicals from our adrenal glands on top of our kidneys. One is named after the adrenal gland, adrenaline. And the adrenal gland is a cortex, like the brain has a cortex. Cortex means bark, the bark of a tree. And so the cortex releases a hormone named after it called cortisol. And these are the stress hormones. And these stress hormones allow us to escape or to fight back. But chronically elevated, they undermine our health in a million ways. So there has to be a stress regulation circuit that will mount the necessary stress response in face of a threat, but will then cool it down when the threat has passed. In addicts, that circuit doesn't function very well. So what they do is, and in fact, in animals or human beings, when you infuse them with cortisol, they're more likely to want to use alcohol or cocaine to soothe themselves. So what the addict does is they soothe themselves with the addictive behavior. So it's a self-soothing. It's a self-soothing is what's going on. And any of you who've had addictive behaviors, whether it's gambling or sex or shopping or food or to substances, you know that your chance of a relapse increase significantly when you're stressed, because you don't know how to handle the stress, because your brain circuitry of stress regulation just isn't up to the task. And finally, saliently, there's the question of impulse regulation. Impulse regulation means that when I have an urge to do something, there's something up here in the cortex that says, no, that's not appropriate right now. When you do brain scans on drug addicts, the most significant finding, or the commonest finding, is abnormality in the area of the brain that regulates impulses. So somebody very astutely said, the problem in addiction is not lack of free will, but lack of a free won't. There's nothing to say no with. Now the question is, why not? And really, again, the question I'm exploring is, what makes somebody addicted? Well, this is where medical education is so behind the evidence. So behind the evidence. Now, when I was diagnosed with ADHD, and so were a couple of my kids, I right away knew that I wasn't dealing with a genetic condition. For a simple reason. The reason is that tuning out, which is what people with ADHD do, is not a disease. What is tuning out? It's a coping mechanism. It's how you deal with stress. It's how the brain automatically deals with stress when it has no chance to escape or to fight back. So, 12 years ago, Harvard probably finally caught up with me. And here's an article from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. And this appeared in the journal Pediatrics, which is the significant pediatric journal in North America. And they say, growing scientific evidence demonstrates that the social and physical environments that threaten human development because of scarcity or stress or instability may lead to short-term physiologic and psychological adjustments that are necessary for immediate survival and adaptation, but which may come at a significant cost to long-term outcomes in learning, behavior, health, and longevity. And what they're saying is that when people are stressed early in life, they will adapt to that stress, and those adaptations help them endure and survive the immediate situation, but will cost them in the long term, in terms of behavior, health, and even their life expectancy. So, my intuition was that ADHD is one of these conditions which is in response to stress, and people tune out, and so on. What I didn't know, and I had to come to Seattle to find out, and I found out only by accident, because I went to a party and I met a psychologist there who said she was coming to Seattle to hear lectures. Here, I think held at the University of Seattle campus, now that I think of it, by two leading figures in brain developmental studies. One is Dr. Dan Siegel from UCLA, and the other was the psychologist Alan Shore, also from UCLA then. And that's when the scales fell from my eyes, because they pointed out over 2 days of lectures that the human brain actually develops an interaction with the environment. So that which circuits develop and which do not has a lot to do with the early environment. So the environment is what shapes the physiology of the brain. And this Harvard article, which sums up all that information very beautifully, says, and I'll just quote briefly from their summation of this. The architecture of the brain is constructed through an ongoing process that begins before birth, in the uterus in other words, continues into adulthood, and establishes either a sturdy or a fragile foundation for all the health, learning, and behavior that follow. Then they go on to say, the interaction of genes and experiences literally shape the circuitry of the developing brain, and is critically influenced by the mutual responsiveness of adult-child relationships, particularly in the early childhood years. So the key factor shaping human brain development turns out to be the quality of human relationships. And as Dan Siegel says, human connections make neuronal connections, make nerve connections in the brain. Which validated my intuition about ADHD, that actually what's going on here is that it's a response to stress, and it's a response to stress when the child is helpless and can't escape or fight back, therefore tunes out. And at such a time, when every second millions of connections are being made, the tune-out becomes programmed into the brain. And the dopamine circuits don't develop. If you take infant monkeys and you measure their dopamine levels, and you separate them from their mothers, and you measure their dopamine levels again a few days later, the dopamine levels fall significantly. And it was here in Seattle at the University of Washington where they did electroencephalograms on the brains of 6-month-old infants with mothers who had postpartum depression. And they compared them to the EEGs, the electrical activity of the brains of infants of 6 months of age whose mothers were not depressed. And they found that they could tell from the EEG of the child whose mother was depressed and whose wasn't. In other words, the electrical wiring of the brain is shaped by the quality of mutual responsiveness of parent-child relationships. And so, you can't look for the answer in the individual brain. You have to look at what's the environment that shaped that brain. Here's a quote by a very great icon psychologist, but also spiritual leader, teacher. He says, the child is very open and can feel the pain and suffering going on in its immediate environment. The child is aware of his own body and can also feel the tension, rigidity, and pain in the body of the mother or of anyone else he is with. If the mother is suffering, the baby suffers too. The pain never gets discharged. The organism never develops the confidence that it can regulate itself, that things will happen the way they should. And that sums up the experience of a lot of people, and particularly people with mental health issues, addiction issues, and behavioral issues, and way beyond that as well. Now, why is the human being so susceptible? Well, that's just straight evolutionary logic. You know, a horse can run on the first day of life. We can't do that for 18 to 24 months, which is to say that the horse is a year and a half to 2 years in advance of us when it comes to brain development. And that's for a very simple reason. What distinguishes us from other animals is actually the large size of our brains, particularly the forebrain. And what instigated the growth of the forebrain was the use of the forepaws as hands, the digits as fingers. And as you start doing this, you need more brain circuitry to regulate and plan that stuff. But in order to take full advantage of our capacity to use the hand, we have to walk on 2 legs. In order to walk on 2 legs, the pelvis has to get narrower. So now you're getting a larger head and narrower pelvis. And if anybody here has given birth, you know exactly what the punchline is. The punchline is already at birth, the head is the biggest part of the body. If it was any bigger, we wouldn't get born, which means we have to get out of there prematurely, which means that most of our development has to occur after birth. And again, which circuits develop and which do not depends on the environmental input. Now, this process already begins in utero, so that if you stress mothers, lots of studies, if mothers are stressed, their placenta will carry more cortisol, stress hormone, to the child, and you can predict that that kid has a much greater chance of developmental problems, behavior problems, learning problems later on in life. They'll also physiologically have greater difficulty regulating their stresses. They'll have abnormal levels of stress hormones in their bodies. And this process continues throughout childhood, but it's most significant in the first few years. So the necessary condition for the development of these crucial brain circuits of emotional self-regulation and motivation and so on is the presence of non-stressed, non-depressed, emotionally available, consistently available, attuned parenting caregivers. Now, what do we actually find when we actually look at the lives of people who are drug addicted, significantly so? And particularly the ones that I worked with in Vancouver's downtown east side, the street addicts. What you find is not that they had attuned, emotionally present parenting caregivers. What you find is that they were all abused, they were all traumatized. In 12 years, I met not a single woman who had not been sexually abused in childhood. Not one, not even by accident, as were many of the men, by the way, or abused in other ways. And if that were only my individual impression, you might say it's either a bleep of some kind, or I'm attracting those kind of people into my practice. I don't know what you might say. But that's also what the large-scale epidemiological studies show here in the United States. Thousands and thousands of people have been studied. Now, these studies came out of, actually, the concern about obesity. These doctors were working in the Kaiser Permanente system in California, San Diego. They were working with, at an obesity clinic, found they could help people lose weight, but found they couldn't help people keep off the weight. And finally, they did something quite radical for a medical doctor. They listened to their patients. And I love knocking my profession, you know. and it's not universally true what I'm saying, but unfortunately it's rather true, generally speaking, for a whole lot of reasons that have nothing to do with the good intentions of the physicians. But the point is that what they found out is these people have been traumatized. And then they did these studies called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Studies, ACE studies. And you can go to the internet and download your own ACE score. Now, for each of these adverse childhood experiences, which includes physical, sexual, emotional abuse, the death of a parent, the jailing of a parent, a divorce. In other words, some disruption of the attachment relationship that's so crucial for healthy development, physiologically and psychologically. Mental illness among the parents, violence in the family, parent being jailed. And by the way, what are we doing when we're jailing all these people? We're making sure that the next generation will also be troubled. For each of these adverse experiences, the risk of addiction goes up exponentially. And by the time a male child has had 6 of these experiences, his risk of becoming a substance-dependent injection-using addict is 4,600% greater than that of a male child with no such experiences. Now, why does trauma like that predispose to addictions? And I'm not saying that everybody who's traumatized becomes an addict, but I'm saying that the more trauma there is, the likelihood is far greater of addictive behaviors later on. Because it's an adaptation. The addiction is a self-soothing behavior. You see it in little babies. They'll suck their thumbs, will they not? When they're not getting the nourishing they need, emotionally. Or they'll rock themselves. Or they'll masturbate. These are self-soothing behaviors. These are adaptations to lack of nurture. So why is it, how is it that early trauma or emotional loss then predisposes to addiction? Well, first of all, because those brain circuits will not develop the way they ought to. So physiologically, it has an effect. It's not just an emotional event, it's a physiological event. That has an impact on brain circuitry, possibly for a lifetime. Number one. Number two, it gives you that tremendous pain that then you try and soothe through substance use or some other addictive behavior. So you got the pain. Number three, you're fundamentally ashamed of yourself because the child looks at everything in a very egocentric perspective, like he or she is the center of the universe. When stuff happens, it's because of him and her. So if good stuff happens, I'm a good person, I must be. But if mommy is unhappy, if I'm being beaten or being traumatized, then that's because I'm worthless. This is a deep sense of shame about the very self that predates the addiction. Of course, the addiction induces more shame, as I can tell you personally, but the shame was there already. And then, because of that shame, you emotionally isolate yourself, which further increases the need to soothe yourself. And in a spiritual sense, when the world treats you that badly in your formative years, then what kind of a worldview are you going to have? You're going to have a view of the world that's basically indifferent or even hostile. There's not going to be any sweet God in your theology. There's either going to be no God at all or a God that has singled you out for punishment. So it's spiritually devastating as well. And all that goes into the making of the addict. Now, excuse me, another myth around addiction is that somehow the drug addict is different from the rest of us. That's another myth. In my book, and I know that some students had difficulty with this, I talk about my own addiction to purchasing classical music. How can you compare that to the heroin addictions of your clients? Well, I mean, the differences are obvious. I'm a respectable physician who, after I do my work, I go home to a comfortable home in a respectable neighborhood. I don't have HIV or hepatitis C. So the differences are obvious, but the similarities are far more interesting. When in the grips of that buying fever, I can't stop. I have to keep going back. 1 week I spent $8,000 without intending to, just because I couldn't stop myself going back to the store. I lied to my wife for years, ignored my children's needs, because what was on my mind was which piece of music to get next. as I mentioned in the book, I once left a woman in labor in hospital to get a symphony. And as I say in the book, I still could have made it back on time, but in the aisles of the classical music store, there are these evil music pushers. You know, and, hey buddy, have you heard the latest symphony performance of Mozart's number 40? You haven't? Oh my God, just listen, it's free to listen, you know. So I missed the delivery of that baby who's now 24 years old and bicycled across Canada to go to university in the Atlantic province, in Halifax actually. It's not benign. And what am I after? I'm not after the classical music. Because after all the music I've bought and given away or sold again, just with the stuff I've left at home, if I started listening now and did nothing but listen, it would take years for me to hear all the music I already have. It's not about the having, it's about the getting. Because the getting releases dopamine in the brain. And that makes me very present and very alert and very alive and very motivated, and I like that. And I think, just one more. But by next day, the high is gone, I feel listless and depressed again, and I start thinking about the one that I didn't pick up that I need to get back and get now. Now, how's that different from what my drug addicts do? As a matter of fact, if you look at the brain scans of shopping addicts or gamblers, it's the same circuits that light up, the reward and incentive circuits that light up in the brains of drug users. What I'm saying to you is there's a universal addiction process that's implicated in all addictions. And addiction, from my perspective, and I may have said it before, but any behavior that you crave, that gives you temporary pleasure, temporary relief, but which you continue to participate in despite long-term negative consequences. That's what an addiction is. Clearly, addiction goes way beyond substances, and the brain circuitry is the same. Doesn't matter what the target is, whether it's internet or pornography or sex or gambling or drugs, it's the same brain circuits involved, it's the same emotional dynamics, it's the same spiritual emptiness, that same hungry ghost phenomena that drives you to keep looking to the outside for something. And addictions are always about trying to complete yourself from the outside, even temporarily. Now, unfortunately, every time you do that, you also wound yourself. Because every time you do that, what you're really saying to yourself is, I'm not enough, further reinforcing your worthlessness. But it's not that the drug addict is any different from anybody else. That just happened to be their particular route. And then when you ask about the legal question, well, that's just a whole other nightmare. Because there's absolutely no science, logic, or humanity behind the drug laws. There's absolutely no reason why heroin should be illegal and tobacco should not be. Tobacco is far more dangerous to your health, unless you overdose. Alcohol does far more damage to the body and the organs and the brain than heroin will. Now, this is a shocking fact, but it's simple science. So, by what logic did we decide that this is going to be illegal and be punished by draconian punishments, and people will sit in jail if they've been caught in possession of marijuana 3 times, 3 strikes, then you're out? And you're going to be in jail for the rest of your life? Whereas you can advertise alcohol in Super Bowl and people can go out drinking and, you know, and that's perfectly legal? What sense are we actually making? So the whole issue of drug addiction is beset by mythology. Now let me come back to the social question. So here's a quote from, well, let me read you a couple of quotes. I mentioned the genetic argument, and let me just point out to you that studies of both animals and human beings have shown that even if you're born with certain genes that can predispose you to addiction, it's the environment that'll decide whether you'll be addicted or not. So if you're a monkey born with a certain gene that protects you from the sedative effects of alcohol, so you can drink a lot of alcohol and really enjoy it and not get tired or uncoordinated. So these monkeys are predisposed to be addicted to alcohol, but if these same monkeys are brought up by their mothers, that gene is turned off. It's turned on only in those genes that are brought up away from their mothers in the peer group. So it's the environment that turns gene on and off. And in human beings, it's been shown that children who are born with some serotonin gene that's a little bit altered, which would predispose them to addiction, but if they're brought up in nurturing homes, they have no more chance of being addicted than anybody else. So the whole genetic argument is tiresome and utterly boring as far as I'm concerned scientifically, and it's based on utterly false premises. Primary is that because something runs in a family, it's got to be genetic, which is, shallow logic. And I'm not going to go into if somebody asks me about it, I'll say more about it, the twin studies and all that, but they're all based on false logic. And nobody said it better than Louis Menand, who's a writer in the New Yorker magazine, and he said, it's all in the genes, is an explanation for the way things are that does not threaten the way things are. Why should anyone feel unhappy or engage in antisocial behavior when that person is living in the freest and most prosperous nation on earth? It can't be the system. There must be a flaw in the wiring somewhere. Now, if you actually look at the system, there's another quote I'd like to offer you. This is by Hubert Selby Jr., who's an American author who died some years ago, but in his preface for his wonderful addiction novel, Requiem for a Dream, which is also a great movie, by the way. It's the most harrowing addiction film you'll ever see. Ellen Burstyn, just magnificent in it, and Julia Roberts got the Academy Award for Pretty Woman that year. But Hubert Selby writes, I believe that to pursue the American dream is not only futile but self-destructive, because ultimately it destroys everything and everyone involved with it. By definition it must, because it nurtures everything except those things that are important. Integrity, ethics, truth, our very heart and soul. Why? The reason is simple. Because life is about giving, not getting. Life is about giving, not getting. So as soon as you buy into that ethic of materialism, our next book, just about to write it, it's going to be called Toxic Culture. As soon as you buy into that, you're isolating yourself from your true nature and from social connection. And you're setting yourself against everybody else. Well, that itself is destructive. And how that shows up, we can clearly see by the examples of the Aboriginal population. So I raised the issue that they had these substances, they weren't addicted. Well, 3 years ago, I was leading a healing ceremony with an Indian band in their longhouse in British Columbia, working with a plant. And there was a 54-year-old Native woman there who said she'd been addicted since she was 9 years old. Now, I'll call her Carly. Carly was taken away from her parents and sent to residential school. Residential school were these institutions where for about 100 years or more, Native children were torn from the arms of their parents very early, and they were sent to these religious-run residential schools where they would educate the Indian out of the Indian. So Carly gets to the residential school, she's 4 years old. This is in British Columbia, by the way, in the early 1960s. We're not talking ancient history here. She speaks her tribal language. That's a no-no. You're not supposed to do that. The teacher, in his or her infinite Christian mercy, deals with this by sticking a pin in the child's tongue. And Carly sits there for a whole hour not being able to put her tongue back in her mouth because if she did, she would cut her lips. And I've heard so many of those stories. So many of those stories. And then if you look at why 30% of my clients in the downtown east side are First Nations origin, why 30% of Canada's jails are filled with, why 30% of the population are Aboriginal people, when they only make up 2 or 3% of the Canadian population, you can't look at their genes. You gotta look at their history of deprivation, dislocation, alienation, loss of lands, livelihood, the forbidding of their spiritual practices, the potlatch which I'm sure was also practiced here in this part of the United States, where people get together and they give something away. It's about sharing. It's about showing that you're not selfish. It's about including everybody else. They made that illegal. Getting at everybody else's expense, that's the ethic. Giving at your own expense is forbidden. And so on and so on. And then we wonder, why is it that these Indians are so drunk all the time? And why are the kids sniffing glue? And why are they committing suicide at some multiple of the national average? Well, it has to do with social dislocation. And there's a wonderful book by a Vancouver-based psychologist, Bruce Alexander, entitled The Globalization of Addiction, where he makes the case that addiction is all about social dislocation. So again, what we're talking about is broad social issues, not just individual predispositions and problems and choices and genetic determinations. Now then, how do you deal with the problem? Well, so Vancouver has a very famous facility called Insight, I-N-S-I-T-E. On the second floor is what they call On-Site, which is a detox facility, where I was the doctor for a couple of years. And Insight is where people bring their drugs to be injected under supervision, without threat of legal hassle, given clean needles, alcohol swabs, sterile water. They even help to find a vein by the nurses if they're bungling around, so they don't have to inject in their necks. And if they overdose, they get resuscitated. The place has been evaluated in about 24 peer-reviewed studies by now. Nobody's ever shown any harm. What they've shown is there's reduced deaths from overdose. There's diminished transmission of disease, as you would predict. I mean, what genius does it take to figure out that to inject with puddle water in a back alley is more hazardous than injecting with sterile water at Insight? The place is used by thousands of people every month. And nothing but success. But our brilliant federal government wanted to shut it down because we're promoting drug use. Wow. There's a huge misconception around harm reduction. The misconception is that it promotes addiction. Well, it does not. Nobody becomes an addict because of harm reduction, and nobody becomes more of an addict because of harm reduction. All it does is it reduces the harm. Is it a bad thing to prevent the transmission of HIV? If anybody thinks that's a bad thing, then you should be in favor of banning harm reduction. Is it a bad thing to prevent brain abscesses or abscesses of the spine that paralyze you by providing clean needles and a sterile swab? Well, if that's a bad thing, you should oppose harm reduction. Is anybody becoming more addicted as a result of harm reduction? No. There's been no evidence for that for anywhere in the world. As a matter of fact, what do we really see? We see there's reduced use. Why is there reduced use? Because, for one thing, people are being treated like human beings by other human beings, maybe for the first time in their life. Now, those of you that work in emergency medicine or nursing or being in emergency wards, you know the routine. When the drug addict comes in, everybody rolls their eyes. There's this judgmental hostility very often. Even if they get the right treatment, which they do, but the tone is that of disdain. You're talking about people who began life as traumatized children. They've never had any trust for authority for really good reason. And authority figures, beginning with their foster parents, very often, their teachers, because they acted out. And by the way, I just want to offer you something. Acting out. We say about kids that they act out, and by that we mean bad behavior, oppositionality, rudeness, aggression. That's not what acting out means. Acting out means that you portray in behavior that which you don't have the language to say in words. That's when you act out. In a game of charades, you have to act out because you're not permitted to speak. Yes, acting out has a very specific meaning. But when these kids acted out, they were punished. They were ridiculed, humiliated. That's their experience of authority figures. Now, when I come along on a bad day, and I'm full of judgment and it's kind of a seething disdain for them, that's what they pick up on. You know, it's not our words that communicate the most. You know, it's who we are that communicates. It's our tone, it's our look, it's how we modulate our voice, whether we look at them and how we look at them, our facial expressions. This is where people really get information. Even if I'm trying to do the right thing, but I do so from a place of judgment and disdain or a sense of superiority or anything like that, that's what they pick up on, and they get wounded over and over and over again. So a harm reduction facility may be the first opportunity for people to experience any level of acceptance. Because the essence of harm reduction is not that we want you to stay an addict for the rest of your life. No, we would love you to give it up tonight. But the essence is, but we know you're not going to give it up tonight. Because at this point, you still perceive that substance as being necessary to maintain whatever you're looking for in life. And if that's how it is for you, we're not going to be judging you for it. We understand how you got there. And so the only question is, if that's how it is for you, how can we help you make that behavior less harmful to you and less harmful to others? But that very message, that very tone of acceptance and non-judgment itself is healing. Because it subverts the addict's idea that I'm a shameful, worthless being, because look, all of a sudden I'm not being treated like one. Maybe I'm not. And that's what opens up the door to healing, about which I'll say more towards the end of my talk. So, I was asked this afternoon about the question about abstinence versus harm reduction. There's no versus. It's not one against the other. It's not one size fits all. I mean, the 12-step groups do a great job, but they don't do a great job for everybody. We know that. And by the way, they miss some very important things, including the childhood trauma piece. They never talk about that. But still, you know, they can be very helpful, tremendously helpful, but not for everybody. So it's not a question of it's one or the other. It's a question of there's no one size fits all. And nobody who sells clothes or restaurant meals or anything else would insist that everybody eats the same meal, the same size of meal, or wears the same clothes and the same size of clothing. Why would we insist on that in the very complex area of substance use and drug addiction? So it's really a matter of tailoring the treatment to the particular individual. I talk about the 4 compassions when it comes to healing addiction. The first compassion is just the ordinary human compassion, where you see somebody suffering, you wish them not to. You wish them not to suffer. And most of us are capable of that on some level. The second level, however, goes deeper. It's what I call the compassion of understanding, where you actually take the trouble to understand the other person. You don't just feel bad for them, you actually take the trouble to understand them. Now that's a step that most politicians who talk about addictions never take. They never ask, and I have to say, by the way, a lot of physicians also don't take. I've talked to a lot of doctors who don't realize that every person they've seen for the last 30 years has been a traumatized person. They just don't see it, which is a whole other conversation about why that's the case. So the compassion of understanding, where you're actually inquiring, well, what happened here? The third level of compassion then is what I call the compassion of identification, where you actually get that that person that's labeled an addict is not in any particular different from the rest of us, except that they've chosen something or they've been driven into something that is looked at upon by society as illegal or somehow morally flawed. But that's the only difference. And there's a lot of people out there causing a lot more damage. Selling drugs, by the way, that kill people or harm people who are profitable and respectable corporate executives. And then you take the drug addict, like the people who make OxyContin and pretended, despite their knowledge, that this was a non-addictive narcotic. And none of them went to jail. But if a client of mine sells an ounce of cocaine, off they go. So let's not pretend that these people are different from the rest of us. They just happen to have suffered more, perhaps. And then the compassion of possibility. And here's where recovery comes into it, because the very word recovery itself is interesting. What does it mean to recover something? Well, when you recover something, you find it. Now, what is it that the person who recovers finds? Well, they find themselves, which means that they never lost those selves, they just lost sight of it. And the biggest trauma, actually, as the same spiritual teacher also points out, is not that you were not loved or supported or that you were hurt. The biggest loss was that as a result of all that, you lost the connection to yourself. And that lost connection to ourselves is what drives all of us to try and fill that emptiness from the outside. Now, I was talking to a friend of mine, Tommy Rosen, who is a yoga teacher in, I think, LA, and he's got this program called Recovery 2 on the internet, and you might want to check it out. There's another one coming up in May, and he interviews me and a whole lot of other people, in the addiction world. But Tommy was telling me they used to live in Seattle. This is when you still had a basketball team, the Supersonics. And he was also a sports guy. He was into sports himself. But he says he lost his addiction to sports one day at a Supersonics game. When the Supersonics held a very slim lead towards the end of the game against the Chicago Bulls. And I have to check this out, but no reason Tommy would lie to me on YouTube. He says, what happened was that, so Seattle attained this very tenuous lead over the Bulls, and all of a sudden the arena went dark, and strobe lights came on, and rappelling down from the ceiling on ropes was this SWAT team with weapons. And they surrounded the Supersonic team, and big signs came on saying, "Protect that lead." And Tommy says, I was wondering, am I the only one here who thinks this is nuts? Well, and my comment with Tommy was that the signs really should have said, "Protect that void." Protect us from the emptiness of going home with our team having lost. Because we feel so lousy about ourselves that we need that victory to elevate us. And hence you have the addiction to sports. Which also, by the way, give you this false sense of community and meaning and purpose and all that. There's a lot of addictions in this society with tremendous harm. So that compassion of identification. But finally, what I call the compassion of possibility. When you look on the addict, not as a lost cause, not as a deficient or somehow defunct human being, but as actually as somebody who's got just as much possibility for spiritual wholeness and for psychological growth and compassion and functionality as any of us. In other words, when you see their possibilities, when you're looking at them, not just through the lens of what they look like and what they behave like, but what are their actual strengths and possibilities? What are the human qualities that make them unique? And what is it that they could manifest in their world if they could get past these self-soothing behaviors? And that's the compassion of possibility. And when you look at people like that, then maybe they can start looking at themselves like that. Now there's the Catholic monk, Thomas Merton, who died I think in the mid-50s, and he was a wonderful writer. And in one of his books, he says that So what the addict gets back is they get back themselves. The addict takes possession of themselves. That's what the healing, that's what the recovery is. That's what they're finding. And Merton says, in order to gain possession of ourselves, we have to have some hope, some confidence, some hope of victory. So I quote this because we have this, yet another myth is that people have to hit rock bottom. Well, then they'll get better. But what's rock bottom? Rock bottom for me as a doctor is very different from rock bottom is for somebody who's living with HIV in the streets of Vancouver. And if that isn't rock bottom, what the heck is? So it's not more defeat that people have that they need. They have had plenty of defeat already. If hitting rock bottom would cure people of addiction, there'd be no downtown east side in Vancouver and no similar neighborhoods here in Washington State. So, Merton says, in order to gain possession of ourselves, we have to have some confidence, some hope of victory. And in order to keep that hope alive, we must usually have some taste of victory. We must know what victory is and like it better than defeat. And victory begins with being treated like a human being and recognizing yourself as a human being. The very thing that our society so chronically denies the addict. And so I believe that if we actually understood this phenomenon of addiction, we saw how human it is, what a natural response it is to unnatural circumstances, how the people that we separate as addicts are so much like the rest of us that it makes us uncomfortable. If we got comfortable with ourselves, if we understood something about human development, the science of brain development and trauma and all that, which is not even controversial, and if we adopted social policies and childcare policies and prevention policies that didn't focus on telling people what's bad for them, but treating them in such a way that so they can feel good about themselves, that's where prevention actually begins, we would have not only much more effective treatment programs for addicts, we would also have a much more humane society for all of us. So thank you.